So that is exam 98-361, Software Development Fundamentals. And, you know, like I said, it's kind of an intimidating process. And what makes it so intimidating is you come out here and you read all this stuff about the exam. And I'm going to do the C# one first, mostly because I think that it is the harder of the two, especially with the new updates that have come out. But you read through some of this stuff and it's very ambiguous about what is actually going to be covered and what you need to study. So these links that are out here and these detail links here have a little bit of overview on what this exam is going to cover. And so the Software Development Fundamentals exam, you know, it talks a little bit about the skills measured and what you need. There's a little synopsis that I pasted in here. Seeking to prove core software development skills, recommended for candidates familiar with and have hands-on concepts with programming. Software development fundamentals can be taken in C# or Visual Basic.net. And so these exams, they get updated on a pretty regular basis. But these, what we call MTA, Microsoft Technology Associate exams, are geared towards students. And so really the idea here is that you have a lot of kind of classroom learning, that you have some hands-on practice, but these are not exams that are ultimately designed towards professionals that have kind of years of experience on working on real software projects. And so that's kind of the line between the technology associate exams and the more professional exams that you might see if you go out and read about Microsoft certifications. So this particular exam has what we call 6 domain areas, and you can see these domain areas here. And the questions are weighted into these categories, and you can see based on percentages. So understanding core programming, you're going to get 15 to 20% of your questions out of there, whereas 20 to 25% of your questions are going to come out of the object-oriented programming. And so not only do the exams kind of change on a regular basis to update maybe what Microsoft considers to be more useful or more relevant information, but sometimes these weightings change as well. There are some additional links at the ends of each one of these domain areas to kind of read a little bit more, some just kind of recommended links and things in there. But this is kind of how the exam is weighted out. Now, one of the things, and if you go look at, I linked this basic like FAQ in here, is Microsoft will not tell you how many questions you're going to get. So they'll tell you on here, it's in here somewhere, how much time that you get. And for this one in particular, it's 45 minutes. It used to be on this screen, maybe it's not. But they won't tell you how many questions you're gonna get. And so that's one of the things here, like it's number 1 in the FAQ. They say somewhere between 40 and 60 questions, but you aren't gonna know. And the reason for that is because they do this kind of non-penalized type scoring. So not only are you going to get a mix of questions kind of broken out into these 6 domains and the various percentages for each domain, but sometimes if you get a question wrong, it may not penalize you for getting that question wrong. If you get the follow-up question right, there might be a scenario-based question with 3 different follow-up questions to the scenario. Sometimes as you continue to get questions right, it will give you more questions until you finally get one wrong. So the exam is variable based on how well you're doing and the questions that you're given and things like that. So there's no way that anyone can tell you when taking one of these certification exams how many questions you're going to get, but it's going to be somewhere from 40 to 60. Now, don't panic when you go to take your exam and you only get like 40 and you think, oh my God, I did super bad. And now I've failed the exam and, you know, my life is over. Like there's no reason for that kind of thought. Just because you got maybe what you consider to be a small number of questions on the exam. Yeah, it'll tell you in here how much time that you get. Yeah, it's 45 minutes is the amount of time that you get for the exam. If you are taking both the C# and the sequel, you can take them like back to back or on the same day. There's not really a rule about that. Really, it's just whatever you think your brain can handle. I know that's intense. If you do fail the exam and you want to retake it, you have to wait 24 hours. You cannot take the same exam twice on the same day. So that's just a fun fact. So let's hop in to some slides where I've put together some sample questions for you to kind of get an idea of the types of questions that you'll get, and kind of how that looks in the various domain areas. Because when we look at, these 6 areas, of which this understanding web applications, this is the newest area that's been added to the exam. This is probably the one that most students that have been studying C# are probably the weakest in. So that's one area in particular that if you just really haven't gotten into web applications or anything with ASP.NET, if you've never touched a web server, there's going to be questions regarding that. And so that one's probably the most difficult domain. So I will link these slides into that main Google Doc at the end so that you can have access to that. But here are these are practice questions which have been kind of distributed and approved for studying for the exam. I can't go in and take the exam on stream or anything like that. You have to sign a non-disclosure agreement before you take the exam, not to discuss the questions that you saw and things like that. All you have to know is HTML, CSS. There are a few web development based questions on the C# exam. There's also database questions on the C# exam. I'm not a big fan of that, but if you look at our domain areas, you'll see there's this understanding database section. So there are database questions. And yeah, in the web applications section, there is going to be some web development kind of questions on there. So I know that can be rough, especially if that's maybe not your forte. So let's get into our first domain area, and that is the understanding core programming. And so there are 4 kind of overarching, no speaking today, things that they want you to really think about in the understanding core programming. So this is where the questions are going to come from. So things like storage, data types, decision structures, method handling, repetition, and error handling. Now, of these, error handling is probably the ones that I see, because when you take the exam, you get this report at the end that will tell you how well you did on each one of the domains. And for this particular one, the error handling questions I think are by far the hardest ones. So if you feel like maybe that's an area that you are lacking, then you'll want to think about how to brush up on that. But I've got a couple of sample questions here for you to look at. Some of these are fairly straightforward. They are all multiple choice. You are not going to get any other question type on the exam. They all will be multiple choice. Now, they may not all be 3 answer. You will get some 4 answer questions. So A, B, C, D. All of the ones in the practice set for some reason are A, B, C. But the thing that really seems to trick students sometimes is Microsoft has this idea about the best answer. So sometimes you will look at the answers to a question and think, gosh, 2 of these are the right answer. And so you always want to think about which one is the best answer and go for that one. Because there are some ones in there kind of designed to trip you up. And I know that with 45 minutes, thinking you might get all 60 questions, you really, you'll struggle with time to read. And so that's one of the other areas that will sometimes trip you up with this exam is the scenario questions are quite long and they take some time to read. But in this case, these first 3 that I have to show you in this domain are easy. So if we had to choose a data type that would be the best choice for keeping track of players' ages and jersey numbers using the least amount of memory, I hope we can all agree that that would be B for byte, right? Because that would use the least amount of memory, but still hold numbers up to 255, which we would hope that that would be enough for ages and jersey numbers. And I know there's not a lot of time for thinking on the exam. I don't know if they do that by design. Like this one, some data will be stored on the heap while other data is placed on the stack. Which of the following will be stored on the heap? If I'm giving you words that you're not quite familiar with, like stack and heap, and you're not really sure what those mean, maybe make some notes to yourself to go look those up so that you do understand those terms when you get to them. So which of the following information would be stored on the heap? That would be the player's name, because it would be stored as a string. Again, if that question is confusing, you can go look up the difference between a heap and a stack and why things like height and age would not be stored on the heap. So here's our third one. It would make sense to store one of these variables as a char. Hopefully we know a little bit about the char data type. And so we would understand that gender is the right answer here. Being able to store a single character for gender versus players' names, which would be far more than single character, and weights, which would be numbers. So in this particular section, they're really looking for, how well do you understand data types? How do you approach a problem with caveats like using the least amount of memory? You will get questions about like floating point data types. When is it most appropriate to use decimal versus float? Things that represent fractional data. So make sure that you're thinking about those kinds of questions. So let's look at this, like our first scenario question. So you get these scenario questions. Again, they're quite long. They will take a little time to read. And then usually there's several follow-up questions to go with the scenario. Now you can go back and reference the scenario wording paragraph as often as you want while you're answering the follow-up questions. But again, it does take a little time to read, so we don't want any panic. So in this particular scenario, Rena has created a DVR application to record her favorite television programs. The code has some bugs. This talks about she's trying to record broadcasts of sporting events, and for non-sporting favorites, she does not want to record reruns, right? So if we look at the question that goes with the scenario, it gives us some code, right? So the C# code with line numbers looks like this. So the first question we have to answer is which line is causing shows to be recorded now even if there's a conflict. So you would look at the code and then you would identify the line number based on what they're asking you to identify. So in this case, the shows are being recorded now even if there's a conflict because of line 5. You can see here it says if not is conflict or not is rerun, then record show now. So that conditional or in there returns true if the show isn't a rerun, even if is conflict is true. So it's just a simple logic error, but we would need to identify that line 5 is the right answer. So here's another follow-up question for the same code. So if we needed to rewrite line 8 because there's a problem, it might be hard to see the problem in the screenshot. Thank you, Major Lift, for the follow. So it says if is conflict and is on later, and there's a semicolon. Can you see that semicolon right there? That semicolon doesn't belong there. It's correct syntax. Yep, but it's not going to run correctly. So we would rewrite this as C. So the if statement itself is fine, just removing that semicolon from the end over here. So C would be the correct answer. And then one more. Rena placed 2 control structures, lines 5 through 7 and lines 8 through 10. And so they want to know, what is the technique that she is using? Is this called parenting, encapsulating, or nesting? So when we have 2 control structures, one is inside of the first control structure, then we call this nesting when we have one control inside of another. So I like this code example because it is a good example of the kinds of scenario questions that we will get that make us read some code. You're not going to have to write any code for this exam. Again, it's all multiple choice, but there are quite a few questions that give us a scenario and snips of code, and we have to go in and kind of review that to answer the questions. So let's look at another one for handling repetition. So this is about a point of sale or cash register application for Fourth Coffee. We're talking about Adriana. Her responsibility is to create a password-protected login system to ensure security of the system. She finished the login window and the password check, but she's having trouble implementing it correctly. The project manager wants the system to give the user 3 attempts to log in correctly before locking them out. In Adriana's most recent version, the system prompts the user for a name and password 3 times, even if the user logs in correctly on the first try, which sounds like she has some kind of logic error somewhere. After the 3rd attempt, the system always locks, even if the input is correct. So in this particular one, they tell us about the problem. They tell us about what's happening, but we don't see any code. We go right into the question, just having to take in what we learned in the scenario as being kind of, you know, what's the probable situation here. So just not really troubleshooting per se, as leaning on some of that programming knowledge we have about how loops work. So Adriana is using a for loop, which works best when. So iterations are known and is unlikely to change. Number of iterations is known but is likely to change, or the number of iterations is unknown. And for a for loop, we would go for A. The number of iterations is known, it's unlikely to change. So the second question would then be, which control structure is best for this login system? So if she's using a for loop, that's the wrong structure, which we don't know, could be part of the problem or why the code doesn't work correctly. But for this particular scenario, a while loop is the solution, because the number of times the loop needs to be executed is uncertain. It depends on the data entered by the user. And so a while loop or a do while, but do while wasn't one of our options. So we just choose what is given to us, what is the best from the options given. That would be the best choice. So hopefully loops, we nail loops, right? We got loops. We don't have to worry too much about loops. So let's look at one about error handling, because again, error handling is probably the weakest point from domain 1. So Lionel is a student at the School of Fine Art. To help pay his tuition, he took a job in the school's student records department. He developed a program that calculates each student's grade point average, which is the GPA. He thought it would be simple because he knows the formula is total grade points divided by total credit hours attempted. However, Lionel's program crashes with new students who have not attempted any credit hours. So instead of just giving them a GPA of 0.0, here is his code. So we get 3 lines. We can see that he's creating a double variable named GPA. He's not initializing that to any value. Sometimes I find stuff in the sample code that cracks me up. We are taking total GP divided by credit hours attempted and putting that into our GPA variable, and then we are trying to write that out. So that is our code. Now I've duplicated that on each section here so that you can look at it when we answer the questions. So given what we know about the problem, what is the most likely exception this code will throw? Here's why these questions are hard. Because if you have not done a lot with exceptions or really looked into the different types of exceptions and exception classes that are present in the .NET framework, these questions will really get you, because how do you know? Now, given the 3 here, you might be able to take an educated guess at the exception that is most likely causing the problem. That would be the divide by 0 exception. Because, we were told in the scenario, he's trying to, let's go back and look at that. He's trying to work with students that have no credit hours, which means that credit hours attempted is 0. So he's trying to take this total GP, which is probably 0 as well if they're a new student, and divide it by 0. So we're getting a divide by 0 exception that will occur. Right, Tokyo, you can't divide by 0. Universe will implode. I'm so glad the .NET framework has these exceptions that keep the universe safe. That is important. So then the follow-up question is, which structure should Lionel use to handle the exception? Well, I hope that we've all studied exceptions enough to know that we use a try-catch to handle exceptions in .NET. There's no such thing as a do-catch. We can catch an exception with a try-catch. So we would choose C. And then one more follow-up question. Which of the following should Lionel's catch block probably include? So if we need to add a credit hours attempted equals 1, so that even if they have never taken any hours, we're going to give them 1 just to make sure we don't divide by 0? Or are we going to set the total GP to 4? Or are we going to set the GPA to 0.0? Now, remember, when using a try-catch block, you put the code in the try that may cause the exception, which would be our 3 lines that we have presented here. In the catch block, that is what activates when an exception occurs. So should we divide by the 0 in line 2 and that exception occurs and we fall into that catch block, the question is asking, what do we do then? And the correct answer here is C. We would set that GPA to 0. Because the division has already been attempted, there's no reason to change the values used in the calculation. We're not doing the calculation again, but we do want to just return that GPA as 0.0. So those kinds of questions that make you think a little bit, follow up upon each other, continue to work in the same scenario, that's what these look like. So if you're not familiar with exceptions, again, if you come into the domains on the website, this core programming, there's some links in here that can help you. I'm going to also add some resources into the doc that I talked about, along with these slides so that you can have those. So if you need to go back and do some reading in a particular domain that you noted was probably going to be a weak point for you, that you would have those links. So let's move on to our second domain, which is one of our biggest ones. You're going to see probably 20 to 25% of your questions about object-oriented programming. And I know from teaching, classes like C#1, where we first get introduced to object-oriented programming, that this is a weak spot for many people. So they're really going to dig into the fundamentals of classes, inheritance, polymorphism, encapsulation. There's a lot of terminology. And so if you don't have that terminology down, this is going to be kind of a rough section. So let's look at a scenario question. I think all of the scenarios in this all the scenarios in this domain are about tailspin toys. Now that won't necessarily be true for your exam, but I don't know what it is about the practice, but tailspin toys. They're developing a simple robotic dog for small children. Sounds awesome. Dog will connect to a computer via USB cable. Kids will be able to use a simple application to personalize their toy to their liking. Although the hardware is nearly complete, Tailspin has not yet created the software that owners will use to customize their toy dog. Seems bizarre. Victor has been hired to begin work on the software. So initially, Victor will need to design a class to represent the dogs. Naturally, the class will be named Dog. The toy, and therefore the dog class, will need to keep track of the dog's name, age, and gender, and it will be able to bark, walk, wag its tail, and sit. So it says he's written some C# code, and so we're going to look at the code and we're going to answer some questions. So here's the code that we have so far. Public class dog. Looks like we have a constructor. We're setting a name, an age, and a gender. So based on what we know from the scenario, which of the following would be a property in the dog class? Would it be bark, name, or dog? Well, properties of classes, when I teach object-oriented programming, I always say that properties are nouns. And so we would look at, bark is not a noun, that's a verb. Name is a noun. Dog is clearly some kind of method with the parentheses behind it, or a constructor in this case. So the correct answer here would be name. That would be B. So that would be a property. Our next question, to create a dog with a different name, age, or gender, Victor should add which one? Another constructor, more properties, or a creation event. So right now our dog is set up with the name Hugo, age of 1, gender M. If we wanted to create maybe a female dog with a different name, what would Victor need to add? Well, he would need to add another constructor. Right? Adding more properties doesn't get us what we want. And a creation event is not going to be able to set up another instance of a dog with different properties. And then finally, which line of code correctly creates a new dog in C#? Hopefully we all know how to instantiate an object by now. But if you don't remember, right, the correct one here is B. So class name, instance name equals new class name. So make sure that you're paying attention to the syntax, paying attention to little things like what is dog.new? I don't know what that is. And then making sure that we're not confusing things and getting them switched around. So hopefully that one's pretty straightforward. So let's look at an inheritance scenario. I swear they get so long, like. So we're still working on our robotic dog toy. Customers would like to choose from different breeds of robotic dogs. So Tailspin's decided to create 3 variations. We're gonna have poodles, bulldogs, and golden retrievers. The company indicated they would consider adding additional breeds in the future. The breeds will have a set of common attributes and behaviors, but each breed may have some unique capabilities. This presents some challenges for Victor as he designs the software children will use to customize the dogs. He doesn't want to write all of this code 3 times. Of course, that would be silly. We also don't want future programmers to create new breeds that are not compatible with the original design. That would be silly. So since Victor realizes that a poodle is a dog, and the same is true for the other breeds, he decides to use inheritance, which is very smart for Victor. Like a bedtime story. And Victor wrote a class, and he lived happily ever after. No, sorry. Okay. So in Victor's new design, poodle, bulldog, and golden retriever are all what? And this is where that terminology really comes in. So are they abstract classes, base classes, or derived classes? Boy, right? Well, I'll tell you right now, they're not base classes, because dog would be the base class. So we could eliminate base classes as being the right answer. Now, hopefully we remember maybe what an abstract class is and why it would be different. And the correct answer here is C. a derived class. So a derived class is a class that is built upon a base class. So let's look at another one. To allow breeds to reuse code and to help ensure that future breeds are compatible, dog, which is our base class, should be declared as which type of class? Is it abstract? Is it derived? Or is it sealed? So here's where, I talk a lot sometimes when helping students pick classes, like, should I take C#? Should I take Java? This is where Java kind of diverges a little bit, and the terminology will trip you up. And so sealed is a tricky one. It's not sealed. They are themselves derived classes, but we don't create the classes using any kind of derived keyword. That's not a thing. They are abstract classes. Abstract classes cannot be instantiated. They are purely a class there to build upon so that we could create, in this scenario, more dog breeds. Implemented methods are shared by all derived classes. So anything I put into dog can be used by poodle, bulldog, golden retriever, later when I decide to make corgis, whatever. But I cannot have just a dog. I cannot instantiate an object of type dog once I make that class abstract. So hopefully we kind of remember, or will remember, the difference. So one more. Which of the following are not going to be inherited by the 3 derived classes? So we have our base class dog. We've got 3 derived classes. In those 3 classes, do they not get constructors, properties, or methods from dog? So we have to think about what gets passed down to derived classes, and the answer is constructors. So base classes will share their properties. Any property of dog is going to be accessible by a derived class. Any method of dog is going to be accessible by those derived classes, but constructors are wholly their own for each class. Make sense? Again, anytime questions, stop me. I'm happy to clarify anything. All right, so let's look at a polymorphism question. This is where stuff's going to get real fun. I think a lot of us don't truly understand polymorphism. We just haven't really had a lot of opportunity to work with it or realize its full potential. And so these kinds of questions can get very tricky. So again, Victor in his Tailspin Toys Robotic Dogs, he knows that his software for personalizing the dogs will be popular with customers. He feels that his basic class design ideas are good. He's ready to think about details. He knows that while all dogs share some common behaviors such as barking, that bark might be different from one breed to the next. The bark method he creates for a poodle will need to be different from the bark method he implements for a golden retriever. So in his dog class, he's created a few methods. So here are the headers. We've got public void bark, public void wagtail, public void walk. So these are the methods that he's created so far. To be able to override these methods in the derived classes, what modifier has to be added to all 3 headers? So these are methods in dog, and he wants to use them in poodle, and he wants to use them in golden retriever, but they have to be different, which means we have to override them using that overrides keyword. But in order to use that overrides keyword, we have to put another keyword on the methods inside of dog. I hope you're following me. So this question is asking, what is that keyword? And the correct answer here is C. So the virtual modifier has to be added to a method in a base class in order to override it in a derived class. And hopefully we remember a lot about overrides. We override the toString method a lot. So we can always try to remember or think about that virtual keyword has to be in there on the back end somewhere in order to make that possible, or we aren't allowed to override. All right, another question. How can Victor invoke the bark method in the dog class from within a derived class? So what would be the syntax that would be correct? Can we just call bark? Do we have to call class name dot method, so like dog dot bark? Or do we use base dot bark? Well, the answer here is C. Anytime that we want to access something in our base class, we use the base keyword. So base.bark will allow us to access members of the base class. Cool? All right, one more for the scenario. What should Victor do if he wants the bulldog class to just use the walk method from dog? So poodle got its own walk, and golden retriever got its own walk, but he's like, hey, bulldogs, let's just use the regular method that's in dog. What does he need to do? Is he going to implement walk in bulldog and copy and paste the code from dog? Is he going to implement walk in bulldog and simply call dog's walk method? Or he just doesn't do anything and does not implement walk in bulldog? Well, I'll tell you that anytime you see the words copying and pasting the code, that is probably the wrong answer. So you can that right out of there. Because really, a lot of what we're trying to do with all of this different stuff about inheritance is reuse code. So don't copy and paste anything. So the correct answer here is C. We don't implement walk in bulldog. So there would be no need to call the dog's walk method. We wouldn't use base.walk. If a derived class does not override an inherited method, because remember, bulldog comes from dog. It's going to get access to all the methods in dog. It's just automatically going to be used. We don't have to do anything, right? And that's the point. We're trying to reuse code. We're trying to save ourselves time. But it's the architecture part that we struggle with sometimes, getting this set up correctly. So there's a lot of keywords in the inheritance and the polymorphism section: base, virtual, sealed, new, override, virtual. I think I said that. There's a lot of them. So if you need to review your terminology for things like polymorphism, that'd be a good plan. All right, so let's look at encapsulation. An encapsulation question. So Victor, still doing a great job. His boss wants to give him a promotion. Way to go, Victor. Nailed it. Unfortunately, because Victor gets a promotion, he's not going to be able to finish writing the software himself. Never used the base keyword before. Yeah, that's a big one. If you've just never used these keywords before, then yeah, it's hard to remember what they do or how they work. So yeah, here in a common scenario, Victor's getting a promotion. He's not going to be able to finish writing the software himself. So a new developer is going to take over the project and really hope that Victor wrote comments. On the new developer's first day, she actually sets the robot's age to a -237 and crashes the program. And to ensure that the new developer doesn't damage code that already works, Victor decides to black box the code he's already implemented. So this means that the new developer won't need to see any of Victor's code, but will be able to use it as she continues the project. Victor can also ensure that values are checked before any changes are made so that the dog doesn't end up with a negative age. This seems like a very specific scenario that I think someone maybe lived through. I don't know. These start to feel very personal, like whoever wrote them was having some bad coworker issues. So Victor has black boxed his code in, and this type of black boxing is what we refer to as encapsulation. So with the principles of encapsulation, we have our instance variables, so things like our attributes or fields, are given the most restrictive accessibility level possible, which typically means setting them to private. And then instance variables of base class are often defined as protected, and this allows derived classes to access the data while still hiding the data from other parts of the program. And really the important reason of restricting access to data is often to ensure validity when that data is changed. So when we have a new developer roll in who makes a funny mistake or doesn't understand the code base and is learning, when they try to set that age attribute to a negative number, things like the gender shouldn't be able to set the value to green, right? Don't talk to me about green genders. So that's the kind of the whole basis for encapsulation. So our questions on this scenario: Victor has implemented several methods in the dog class that he uses for bark. All right, so things like open mouth and closed mouth, and he does not want those methods to be called by any derived classes. They're only for the dog. Poodle doesn't get them. He wants to lock them down. So which access modifier would we use? Well, like I said, the highest level of protection is private. So we would set them to private. Then Victor's primary methods, bark, sit, walk, wagtail, should be accessible from anywhere in the project. Now, if you need something accessible to anywhere in the project and you don't have any restrictions, then that is a public accessibility. So that is A. And then, which of the following provides a mean for reading and or modifying private attributes? So hopefully, whoever taught you encapsulation, I don't want to call out any instructors tonight, they talked a little bit about walled gardens and why we do this. And then, of course, we've learned to set up C properties for modifying private attributes, and oftentimes error checking them and making sure that the data is valid before allowing changes to those private attributes. So I always like to think, and I have no problem sharing this with students when I'm teaching, that a lot of software is defensive, and it's defensive against your own coworkers. So you're writing software with a team of people. Some of them are less experienced, some of them are more experienced. But you need to protect that software and each one of those little individual attributes and make sure those values are going to be valid using all of the tools that you have available. You cannot simply just assume that every developer who comes along and touches your code base is going to understand what they can or cannot submit to a value, what the appropriate range is going to be. You have to enforce that. So that is what encapsulation is all about. So that is the end of section 2 on understanding object-oriented programming. Again, you will get 20 to 25 questions from this particular domain. That's quite a few. So you'll definitely want to study and brush up on each one of those domain areas in there. Again, breaking out all the different things and some links. But this is, as you can see, the only one that you're going to get more than 20% of the questions out of, because they consider this to be like the thing that you should know. Which I agree. I mean, C#.NET is an object-oriented language, and object-oriented design and architecture is important to understand. And so that's the gist. All right, our next domain is understanding general software development. Now, it's kind of a strange mix of things in here. And I honestly thought that with this year's revision of the exam, they would maybe do something with this section, because it seems like when we go through the different domains, core programming makes sense, object-oriented programming makes sense, web applications is new, desktop applications make sense, the understanding databases is bizarre. So this is like the island of misfit toys. What goes inside general software development is a little bit of a hodgepodge of stuff. So they talk about application lifecycle management, application specifications, algorithms, and data structures. So if we dig into like what goes in here, like what does that mean? Well, application lifecycle management, a lot of the questions that I've seen are about software testing. So how do we test? Different types of tests. When do you test? Why do you test? Right? Hopefully we all understand those kinds of things. Application specifications, right? Like reading specifications and turning them into steps or prototypes, selecting application types, understanding various types of components you can use. And then there's just, it's like they wanted to quiz you on data structures and they just didn't even know where to put it. So they just shove it in here. So this is where you will find questions about arrays, stacks, queues, linked lists, sorting algorithms, performance implications, choosing the right data structure, those kinds of questions. If you have taken a data structures course or an algorithms course, you're ahead of the game on this one, but I think a lot of C# students probably struggle in that area just because there's only so much you can shove into a 16-week software development class. So let's look at our first scenario question. And they're almost all scenario questions. I don't know if you've noticed that since those first few that I showed you in Domain 1, there are all these giant paragraphs of text with 2 to 3 follow-up questions. That is primarily how this exam will go. You will have very few standalone kind of multiple choice questions that aren't attached to some kind of giant paragraph. So in this scenario, we have a new project manager for a reservation system for Blue Yonder Airlines. She's going to lead a team of developers that are tasked with the phases of the application lifecycle. She met with her team, managers from each branch of the company. They discussed the company's needs, basic features. So they're building this application. It's going to be web-based. It will allow customers to search flights, book reservations, check in online. Developers have started outlining the program, and although they haven't begun coding, they are beginning to sketch out the classes and objects of the program using UML. Their outline is not complete, but a plan for accomplishing the required tasks is coming together. She wants to divide the job in such a way that team members can work on different parts of the program at the same time. Right? There's a lot in here about this is just general software development stuff. If you've taken a systems analysis class, hopefully this sounds more like a systems analysis question. So after her meeting with the company's manager, which stage of the application lifecycle is this? Right, so we talked about, she had this meeting. They talked about specifications and like what the application needs. We know we're not in development because I haven't started writing any code. In fact, we're not even in design yet. We are in planning. So planning, sometimes called envisioning, is the phase in which you gather the client's needs, talk about requirements, discuss what the application needs to do, who is using the application, identify stakeholders. Right, so that's the planning phase. The use of UML in this scenario is a waste of time because they haven't started writing code. This is all of my students' answer is A. I don't even understand why some of you jump right into writing code. It baffles me. I had a capstone student ask me that the other day. He was like, do you ever actually like diagram stuff before you write code? I was like, yeah, all the time. Because otherwise you're just going to waste your time. So we definitely know the answer is not A. Helps ensure that different components will work together when finished. Or C, helps ensure that the clients understand how the team will create the software. So the answer here is B. The UML is going to help ensure that different components will work together when finished, that we understand kind of the system from a very high level view. We haven't left anything out, that we understand how all the different pieces fit. And then a testing question. As the team writes code, they will be asked to test their classes. They're testing independently. What is this strategy called? If you've never really looked into different types of software testing or were not maybe introduced to this in your programming classes, I know I make all my C# students write unit tests. The correct answer here is unit testing. So whenever we're writing our test classes independently, they're unit tests. You can go look up different phases of testing, different types of testing, if you're not sure what that means. Also, if you are not sure about the application lifecycle, ALM, Application Lifecycle Management. You can look that up as well. Planning, designing, developing, testing, and maintenance are the phases, but you can go read more about what goes into each phase. If you took a systems analysis class, we talk a lot about the systems development lifecycle, which is fairly similar, but the phases are named a little differently. If you aren't familiar with UML, or the fact that it stands for Unified Modeling Language, or what it's used for, that would be a good thing to look at in this particular section. Many programmers seem to be familiar with class diagrams, which is a form of UML in object-oriented programming, but there are lots of different UML diagrams for different types of systems design. And so if you've not taken that kind of class or looked into that before, it'd be good to brush up a little bit on that. So let's look at a specifications question. Ari has completed an internship with Contoso Pharmaceuticals, working with their developers on software used by the company's employees. His supervisor is very impressed and has offered Ari a job on the development team for Contoso's next generation application. The company has decided to start from scratch, allowing the new team to develop the application while employees continue to use the old system. The company currently produces more than 1,000 products and plans to expand. The new application will track all of the company's inventory, as well as some of the basic shipping and receiving details. Employees should be able to search through the company's product catalog and view product details such as description, image, in-stock quantity, and cost. So you get these very big paragraphs of, basically just an idea, concept, specifications. What does the company want? What are they looking for? And then you get a small little multiple choice question like this. What type of application would be a good fit? Do you think this is a console, a database, or a Windows Service application? Well, I know that's rough. Like, you read these big paragraphs and you're trying to take all this information in and you're trying to kind of sort it all out. So sometimes it helps to kind of look ahead at the questions and see, what are they really asking me? And in this case, a database application, right? We need to store, view, and update a large amount of inventory records. And so that would be the best choice here. So many of the company's computers are old with limited RAM and hard drive space. But they're all connected to the company's intranet. So how can Ari ensure that the new version will work with all of the systems? So this is kind of a higher level question, but they give you some kind of funny answers that really make this easier to think about. In this case, you can almost select the right one just by elimination because these are kind of weird answers. We're clearly not going to write the program in an older programming language. We're clearly not going to develop anything for Windows 98. It's bizarre. So we're going to make the program a web application so it can be accessed by the browser so that we don't really have to worry about how old these poor computers are. And then finally, Ari's supervisor has asked him to prepare a non-functioning demonstration of what the new application will look like so that department managers understand what is being developed and how they will interface with the application. So anytime we make a non-functional anything, it's a mock-up. It shows the client what the interface will look like. You can mock up some features, sometimes hard coding data in there or anything, but it usually just doesn't even do anything. Good? Yes? You guys are so quiet. It's awesome. Hopefully that just means it's clear, but okay. All right, an algorithms and data structures question. Cassie has agreed to help her soccer coach Ken keep track of the team by creating a software program, especially for the task. The roster application will make it much easier for the coach to keep track of his players' personal information and some simple statistics. Now that Cassie has completed some initial planning, she needs to decide how to organize all of the data in her program. The application will need to keep track of many players, allowing the user to search through and pull up any individual's data And of course, the coach will need to print a few reports, such as a complete roster sorted by jersey numbers, a phone list arranged alphabetically by players' last names, and the team leaders and goals. So, again, a lot to take in. Which of the following data structures is a good choice for organizing the players? So if you're not familiar with these types of data structures or have looked into, kind of the differences or anything like that, these questions can be tricky. But given the answers here, we would want to go with an array, because arrays are well suited for programs that need to access data in any order. So when the user needs to perform a search versus stacked or linked lists. So again, if you're not familiar with these types of data structures, I would suggest that you study a little bit about different ones. Which of the following would help Cassie arrange the players in alphabetical order? So this is an algorithm question. Again, if you're not familiar with different types of searching or sorting algorithms, it would help to just go out and kind of skim some basics of, again, what is a binary search? What is a bubble sort? We know right off the bat that it's not going to be a queue. A queue is a data structure. It's not a way of finding information or storing it in a particular order like this. So a bubble sort, given our options, is going to be the best one that will allow her to arrange the players in alphabetical order. Again, assuming that they're in the array that we told her to make. But so then which data structure could Cassie use if she only wanted to retrieve players using a last in, first out method? Now this should be an easy question if you've read anything about stacks or queues. Again, different types of data structures, and a last in, first out data structure is a stack. All right. So that is the end of domain 3. Again, that is kind of the island of misfit toys when it comes to questions about specifications, questions about testing, data structures, different types of searching and sorting algorithms. There's a lot of weird stuff in there. You're going to get 15 to 20% of your questions from this particular domain. So there might be a lot for you to kind of go in there and brush up on if you aren't familiar with those things. So let's move on to domain 4. Domain 4 is the new domain for this year on the update for the exam. There used to be questions about web applications, but there wasn't a whole domain about it. And so now 15 to 20% of your questions are going to come from this web applications domain. Now this does have, as I talked about at the beginning of the stream, questions about basic web design stuff. So not just like C#, not just .NET, but HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There's not a ton of them, but they exist. There are also going to be questions about ASP.NET web applications. So if you've not really messed with one of those, or maybe really didn't understand it when you did, I know we don't get very deep in our class. So things like page lifecycle, event models, state management, that can be a little tricky. There's some stuff in there about web hosting. If you've never looked into hosting your own website, virtual directories, websites, using Internet Information Services, which is Microsoft's web server IIS, those questions can be super hard if you've never even seen that stuff before. And then web services, which is a different area that we do cover, but just some terminology like SOAP and web service definition language and how to use web services and consume them in your C# applications. So there's a lot in this domain, even more questions than before. So I have some samples for you to look at. Again, scenario-based ones. So Tanya owns a small dance studio. She's looking for ways to bring in new customers and improve communications with her existing customers. She's not particularly knowledgeable about web design. Several years ago, one of her dance students offered to create a website. Don't do that. The student moved on to university, so she's relied on a few volunteers to maintain the site. It's disorganized, it lacks consistency, it's probably a hot mess. Poor Tanya. Okay, so knowing she can't fix the site herself, she asked her nephew. No, don't do this either. Don't ask your nephew. Before Maxim creates a page, he wants Tanya to have at least a basic understanding of the technology involved. I recently gave a crash course in HTML to a streamer friend of mine that I created a website for him, and then he wanted to go figure out how to edit it. I can tell you right now, this scenario is real. It is terrible. Don't do it. All right, so questions. Which technology uses tags to indicate how information should be displayed in a web browser? That should be an easy question, right? We get so intimidated about these questions in the web domain, but hopefully we know that it's HTML, right? Tags. Tags is the key word there. It's tags. HTML. Which of the following is a key advantage of using CSS? All of these are good answers. I like this question because it is an example of the ones where sometimes all of these are the right answer, but which one is the best answer? So it allows the web page to be interactive, allows the site to incorporate multimedia, simplifies formatting. It's C. Simplifies formatting of multiple pages within a site, right? All of those are true. All of those are reasonable answers, but there's only one best answer. I like this question. It's very existential. What is JavaScript? Unless it's JSX. No, nobody likes JSX. All right, so what is JavaScript in an existential way, right? A markup tag that manages various font settings? Probably not. A server-side technology for running Java applications? Oh God, no. A client-side technology for making web pages interactive, right? So yes, that's the correct answer. All right, let's look at another scenario. This is an ASP.NET web application scenario question. So Maxim, who's in way over his head, has spent some time talking with his aunt about a new website for a dance studio. He's beginning to get ideas on how to update and improve the site. Tanya's old site is pretty basic. He believes he can add some new features. One of his priorities is to make the site a little more interactive with buttons that respond to mouse rollovers and a slideshow to display images of the studio. He also wants to implement online shopping for dance apparel. He's in way over his head. Guys, let's just... F's for Maxim. All right, so you read the scenario, and then our question is, Maxim's mouse rollover effect can be accomplished with a client-side script. Which of the following is a client-side technology? Okay, so PHP is a server-side programming language, so is ASP.NET. So that leaves JavaScript. If you don't know the difference between a client-side versus server-side coding language and web development, you can go find many resources online to help you with that information. In a standard HTML site, page information is lost each time the user refreshes a page or moves to a different page. Which of the following allows page information to be retained? So this is just terminology. You don't really need to know a lot about how it works to know that we're talking about state management. When we want to capture a user, and then as they move from page to page, that information that we've captured stays with them as an identified user, then that is state management. So you can go read more about state management, but that is what they're talking about in this particular question. So then Maxim wants to use cookies to keep track of users' wish lists. What is a cookie? I would hope if we're in a computer science program, we know what a cookie is. But if you don't, you can go look up what a cookie is. And in this case, the correct answer here is A. It is text data stored by the user's web browser. That is probably the most simplest definition of what a cookie is. But that is the right answer. So these things about client side versus server side, some things about event models. So web applications that are kind of similar to client applications that manage state, that have kind of a life cycle, right? That's what those kinds of questions are going to be about. All right, and then we have questions about web hosting. And again, if you've never really looked into hosting your own website, if you have no experience with hosting websites, if you've never touched IIS, these are going to be tricky. So you might want to do a little reading. So with plans for Tanya's, is it Tanya? Tanya? Let's go with Tanya. Dance Studio's website beginning to take shape. It's time for Maxim to think about how he will put the site on the internet. Maxim doesn't have a lot of experience creating web applications. Most of his experience is with traditional Windows applications. He knows that a website is hosted on a server, but he's never worked with a server before. Plus, his aunt doesn't have a lot of money for this project. Again, these scenarios feel so personal. Someone really just had a lot of anger to get out. So he has to keep costs to a minimum until the site brings in some business. Are state management questions specific to standard or core? Great question. All of these are about standard. There is currently no .NET Core in this exam. I expect to see some soon, given the popularity of .NET Core, like maybe next year. But they don't really give us a lot of advanced information. They just release a new exam and then that's what we get. But as of right now, there is no core. Yeah, great question. Yeah, because that's not something we've had to really think about. All right, so Tanya's let her nephew run all amok. So why is an ISP probably a good choice for Maxim? This question is not great. Because I don't know of anyone who hosts websites with their ISPs anymore. Not in a while. So this question actually feels kind of dated, which is weird. And I know we run into stuff like that. It's just like stuff hasn't been updated or whatever, but you would think since the exam just had a refresh that... Anyway. So some internet service providers offer website hosting. I don't even know of any off the top of my head. Does Mediacom do stuff like that? I don't even know. Anyway, ISPs are not free. An ISP subscription does not include a copy of Windows Server. They will provide tech support and maintenance. I don't think you're gonna find any ISP that hosts your website give you maintenance. So this is an odd duck question. When you get these odd duck questions, you have to kind of rely on that, that testing strategy where you try to eliminate the ones that are clearly not going to be the correct answer and then take a nice educated guess. We talked about at the beginning about how Microsoft scores the exam. Not every wrong question is a penalty. So what they wanted to do was create an environment where it was okay to guess. So it is okay to guess when you get these kinds of very odd questions. But anyway, an employee at a reputable ISP tells Maxim that they use Windows Server and he needs to understand the basics of Internet Information Services, which is IIS. Which of the following is not a role of IIS? So IIS is, again, it's a web server, lives on a Windows server. And its job, right, to deliver HTML documents to web servers, to enable server-side scripting such as ASP.NET, to enable client-side scripting such as JavaScript. It will do all of these things, or it will do two of these things. It will not do B, but it's worded weird. to enable server-side scripting such as ASP.NET. I mean, you can run ASP.NET stuff on IIS, but that's not a role of IIS. So this is like wording. Yeah, not really into this new domain. The ISP tells Maxim that they support virtual directories. What is a virtual directory? So a virtual directory is B, a directory name that maps to a physical location on the server. Again, if you've never touched a Windows web server and you have no idea what any of this means, it would be worth it to do a little reading just so that you weren't completely in the dark. But I understand that that's difficult to retain and study for if it's not something you've ever done. You could, you know, put your own instance of IIS up on your Windows computer and play with it, I guess, if you wanted to. Maybe Tanya should just create some social media accounts instead of a website. Yeah, well, I'm with you. You know, just get some social media pages or something. Maybe Tanya should just make better life decisions. It's me. All right. So let's look at a web services question. Maxim has worked hard to publish an exciting, I'm sure it's amazing, professional site for the dance studio. It's been available for more than a month now. Customers have given Tanya great feedback. They love all the interactive media, I'm sure. And the simple consistency of the overall design. Best of all, the new site has increased her income by attracting new students and allowing customers to purchase items from home. I can't even imagine how that works. With the extra money, she wants to pay Maxim to put a little bit more into the site. He's getting money for this? Holy crap. Some catchy additions. She'd like her homepage to display the current weather and traffic, but she thinks a Bing search box would help users find information quickly. Although Maxim has never programmed this type of functionality before, he knows he can use his web services to help. Oh boy. That's something. That's beautiful. Alright, so in this context, what is a web service? Is it a process for running a script and serving the resulting HTML to a client? Is it a program that enables secure web-based interactions? Or is it a system that allows multiple programs to interact via the internet? Well, hopefully, my C# students, at least, have written a web service and that they know that it is C. Right? So multiple programs can interact via the internet, connect in, run some code, right? Gives them all a central place on a server somewhere. This is my favorite part of the new domain. Questions about Bing. I'm strongly curious who uses Bing on a regular basis. Because I don't know anyone who uses Bing on a regular basis. So when using the Bing API to add search capabilities to the site, what is the web service role of Bing? Yeah, maybe you should Google that. DuckDuckGo it. People make their nephews make websites. Old people. I've heard Bing is good for one thing and one thing only. Yikes. Anyway. So, in this context, the Bing API, what is the web service role of Bing? And his grandson. I love you, Hunter. It's true. So, the web service role of Bing in this scenario is that of a provider, because the web studio, or the dance studio website, is the requester. So the provider would be Bing API, giving information like weather and traffic to the dance studio website. It's so bizarre. All right, which of the following is a framework commonly used to access a web service? Java is not the answer here. Java is probably never the answer on a C# exam, just saying. Or ever. I mean, let's just crap on Java for a minute. Java is never the answer. SOAP is a framework used to access web services. ASP.NET can access web services, but isn't a framework for doing so. So don't get tripped up by that. So the correct answer here is SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol. Right? All right, so that is the end of domain 4. Questions about web services, frameworks that allow programs to communicate with each other via the web. You may see questions about web service description language, which is WSDL. It's a XML format that allows for intercommunication amongst web services and development tools. It uses SOAP, so you might see stuff like that. I think there's a couple of links. Yeah, down here about modern web development, and then developing web applications with ASP.NET has some extra information about, yeah, it talks about WSDL in here. So our understanding desktop applications domain hopefully is probably, you know, one of our easier domains. Goes a little bit into UI design, but mostly talks about like console applications, Windows applications, desktop stuff. Yeah, Windows Forms. So hopefully this domain is easy for you. So questions, let's look at them. Julia doesn't have a lot of free time while she's studying computer science at her university, said everyone. But in the evening, she enjoys playing online role-playing games. This is weird. I actually know a girl named Julia who plays online role-playing games at night. But she did not study computer science. This question is not about her. She plays several games on a regular basis. She enjoys leveling up her characters and completing quests for special items. However, because her playing time is both limited and fragmented, she has difficulty keeping track of the status of each of her characters. So she decides to create an application to keep track of the progress of her different characters, including levels and quests. This is bizarre. She envisions a simple application that will allow her to select a character and then view and edit relevant information, a picture of her character, its current level, XP needed to advance, current quest item, and so on. I don't know what RPG she's playing that doesn't keep track of these things for her. She should probably just play WoW. Anyway, what type of application does Julia need? A console application? A Windows Form application implementing SDI? Or a Windows Form application implementing MDI? Holy crap, guys! What is SDI and MDI? Because if you don't know the difference, you probably just pooped a little on your certification exam. Because we know it's not A. So it's got to be B or C. Do we remember what SDI and MDI stand for? I like that they did this. They didn't let you kind of like process of elimination out of it. So single document interface or multiple document interface. A single document interface application will only let you have one document frame window open at a time. MDI applications are going to let you have multiple document frame windows open in the same instance of an application. You know how to do this. You've probably written these. You just don't have the terminology. So, no panic. It's okay. In this case, I would say the answer is B. Right? Single form. Because she only needs one window at a time. Console application can't be the answer here because we said we were using an image. She wanted to be able to display her character's image. Otherwise, console would be a relevant answer here. MDI, that's tricky because, I mean, we can just assume that she would only need one window at a time given the scenario. But that's a tricky one. All right, so for which of the following situations would visual inheritance be useful? So if we have several different forms displaying the same data in different ways, or several different forms displaying data from tables in the same database, or several different forms using the same basic layout and UI features. So the answer here is C. Visual inheritance is the idea that we have several different forms. They're all sharing kind of the same layout, the same features. They feel the same. Terminology. Which of the following describes how the event model might function in Julia's program? So a button click event is handled by code that creates a new character. A new character event is handled by code that asks for user input, or a loop event cycles through the various characters, displaying each on the form. Okay. I'd say A button click event handled by code that creates a new character. We don't need to create a new character event, especially since we've already determined that this is a single form application. All right, let's look at another scenario. That first one was about like Windows form application. This one's more about Windows services. So employees at Contoso Limited engage in extensive word processing sessions while preparing manuscripts for publication. Managers are worried that employees who type for extended periods of time may have problems with repetitive motion injuries and eye strain, as well as general fatigue. They've asked the IT department to come up with a way to help reduce the chance of such injuries. Anna is developing an application that will monitor keystrokes. When a user has typed 2,000 words in fewer than 30 minutes, the application will display a notification reminding the user to take a brief break and stand up for a stretch. Anna has decided to write the application as a Windows service. So our questions: what type of user interface do most Windows services, including Anna's, employ? Well, if you've never written a Windows service, that might be a tricky question. But most Windows services have little to no UI because there's just no real interaction with them until, like in this case, it will display something when that 2,000 keystroke threshold has been passed. So little to no UI is the common way to do it. Which of the following is not a characteristic of many Windows services? So intended to run continuously while the computer is on, can be configured to start when the operating system is booted, generally designed to require user intervention at timed intervals. So A is generally a characteristic of many Windows services, and so is B. So C, most Windows services are not going to require user intervention at timed intervals. That would be kind of a strange service to have. And a Windows service generally has 3 different states after being started. And maybe you've seen these before. If you've gone into like your startup and adjusted any of your Windows services, maybe you don't like things coming on, when the computer starts. But they have running, stopped, and paused. Interrupted and completed even sound weird. So that is the end of our desktop applications section. The last one we have is understanding databases. And so if you haven't taken a database class, these questions, there's kind of some interesting in-depth database questions. So hopefully, if we did a Windows kind of desktop database application, that helped you understand a little bit about databases enough to be confident on the exam. But it gets into relational database management, queries, connection methods. There's some SQL syntax in there. And so this is going to lead us kind of right into talking about the database exam, because this is our final domain. And so we can get in here and see, you know, there's going to be some stuff about SQL, creating and accessing stored procedures, updating, deleting data, connecting to data stores, flat files, XML, things like that. Those kinds of questions could be in here. So, a couple of scenarios. Jesper pays for school by working part-time in a vintage record shop that sells music albums on vinyl. The store has thousands of albums by thousands of different artists, but the owner does not have an inventory system. Yeesh. He simply organizes the albums by artists on the store shelves. That means when a customer asks for a particular album, if it's in stock, Jesper must go to the shelves and look. So he wants to put together a simple inventory system so that he can look up which albums are in stock from a computer behind the counter. He'll set up a relational database to store the information. He's going to want to store artist ID, and each album will get an album ID number. So in that scenario, just based on what you know about what he needs to store, what function do artist ID and album ID fulfill in Jesper's relational database as described above? So, you know, hopefully we just understand that terminology a little bit to know that these would be primary keys. When we're designing a database, unique identifiers are primary keys. Jesper will link albums to artists by adding an artist ID field to his albums table. In this albums table, what is the artist ID? So when we have two tables with their unique identifiers and one is referencing the other, that is a foreign key. So the foreign key from the albums table refers to the primary key in the artist table. Which of the following will result from the use of a relational database for this project? So we'll minimize or eliminate redundant and repetitive data, increase processing time resulting from insufficient storage of data, or require the use of a web server. Well, a relational database is almost always going to do A, eliminate redundant and repetitive data. Our next scenario with Jesper, he's designed and implemented a relational database to keep track of the inventory at the record shop. He needs to be able to read and modify the data itself. He'll use SQL query for his database operations. The application must enable Jesper to add to the database when the store gets a new album and modify data such as quantity in stock and price. Additionally, he'll need to pull data from the database, find artists or albums, list the current inventory, and list out of albums that are currently out of stock. So, which SQL command should Jesper use to add a new album to his database? So, if you've never written SQL before to put data inside of a database, that would be an insert statement, right? We don't add, we insert. And we can't update information unless it already exists. And then Jesper can save frequently used queries as update files, database methods, or stored procedures. And of course, the answer here is C, stored procedures. Anytime we have a query that we want to run on a regular basis, we can store that and run it as a stored procedure. Which query could retrieve the artist U2 from the table of artists? So a little bit of a syntax question here. Are we selecting U2 from artists, select star from artists where artist name equals U2, or select star from artists where U2 in artist name? And the correct answer is B. So if you're not familiar with some basic SQL syntax of like how to query a table or something like that, you are going to see a couple of questions like that on the test. I say that with certainty, but I can't ever guarantee that you're going to see something like that. But there typically are a couple of questions about either select, insert, update, or delete, using statements such as from, where, or order by. So just basic kind of entry-level SQL stuff that you can find on like W3 Schools or something if you need to brush up on that. All right, here's our last one. Final scenario about database connection methods. So with a solid database design and a few stored procedures to help manage his SQL queries, Jesper turned his attention to a user interface for his application. Using Windows Forms, he now has the essential elements in place to connect his application to the database. He decides to use a disconnected approach, meaning that he will copy what he needs from the database to memory, then disconnect from the database. When the user changes data, the application can connect again and update the database. So, what is the advantage of Jesper's use of a disconnected data access model? I know I try to impress upon my students to use this kind of model where appropriate because of the advantages that it has. Really, the answer is A, it minimizes the impact on the database server. It has a lot to do with internet connection, but B is not correct because it does require an internet connection. It just doesn't require one to always be open or available. Typically in this disconnected model, we want to reduce the latency of any back and forth transactions to a database where we're continually having that back and forth traffic. So it makes a much smaller connection footprint when it comes to bandwidth. What is the term used to describe an in-memory cache of the database? And that is a data set. So in-memory cache, we go out to the database, we do a select, we pull in a bunch of information, that is a data set. And what object contains the information ADO needs to connect to a database? So ADO, if you're not familiar with, is our data access model for .NET, and it needs a connection string. Connection strings are what contain, like server information, login information, how you're going to authenticate, what's your database you're connecting to, all of the information it needs to make that successful transaction. So also in this domain, you might see questions about XML, data sources as XML, so how to read a data source that's an XML file, and LINQ, the language integrated query, LINQ. So again, if that's not information that you are familiar with, then definitely brush up on that. So I will add these slides to the doc so that you can have those. Again, exclamation point doc if you need that in the chat. We'll get you access to this document that I have so that you can use the links and have the sample questions. This website is fairly helpful in that when you expand these, there's the links to various things that you can look at. I do have some other notes and things that I'll plop in here after the stream, so you can take a look at that maybe tomorrow morning for the most updated version. But again, 45 minutes, 40 to 60 questions, mostly scenarios, all multiple choice. No panic, just breathe. The pass rate for my students on this exam, and I say my students, any students that go to school where I teach, is about 75%. I believe you have to get a 70 or higher. I used to say on here. I have to look, but I think it's a 70. Maybe they changed it. The exams are expensive. Would I say the questions are representative of the difficulty of the actual certification exam? Yes. Again, the questions aren't overly difficult. Sometimes the presentation of the answers does give you pause because, again, there might be 2 correct answers. You need to know and understand how to choose the best answer, which can sometimes really show you're learning or not. The exam is scored automatically, so you'll know immediately if you passed or not, and it will give you a score report that will break down each of the domains and give you a domain score. So you can kind of see, you know, out of the 6 domains, you know, maybe you're light in the object-oriented programming or whatever, and it'll show you kind of how you scored out of each one of those as well. Give you a little overview of what that looks like.